All right, let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be covering coding from scratch in JavaScript. So this applies to you if you are an SWD 100, CFS 103, or CFS 105. All right, so what is JavaScript? JavaScript is the programming language of the web. It is the only programming language understood by every modern web browser. It enables us to build the interactive websites we use daily. The way that you can think of it is JavaScript's kind of like the muscle of the web page, right? It does all this stuff, and it allows you to manipulate information and interact with the user. So anytime there's a user interaction, JavaScript comes into play. For example, if you're submitting a form or clicking a button and that's supposed to do something, then that's when JavaScript comes into play. So the first thing you want to do in order to get your JavaScript working with your file is using a script tag. So in HTML, we know that this is an opening tag and this is a closing tag. So we have an attribute in our script tag that is source, and we set that equal to the name of our file .js, assuming that it's in your root directory. So if we look at some code here, we have, this is just a basic HTML skeleton file. If I want to connect this to my JavaScript file, first I need to have a JavaScript file, so I'm just going to call it script.js. Now I have a JavaScript file and I want to connect this JavaScript file to this HTML file. So inside of my body, at the very end, so before your closing body tag, you're going to have your script tag. So we're going to have script, attribute, source, set it equal to our name of file. So that's going to be script.js. Close that. That's the closing of our opening tag. Now we need a closing tag. There we go. So here, line 12, we are linking our script file to our HTML file. Similar to a link tag when you are connecting your CSS to your HTML, now we're linking our JavaScript to our HTML. Now you'll see sometimes where you'll have script tag and then a bunch of JavaScript written in between the script opening and closing tag. We're going to go ahead and put them in separate files. That way it's easier to track. All right, so the first things first, we're going to go ahead and discuss variables. You can think of variables as containers in the sense that they're holding a value that we can use throughout our websites, our applications, and projects. When declaring a variable in JavaScript, we use the var keyword followed by the name of the variable. So if we look at the example here that I'm showing here, var, we're saying, hey, we're declaring a variable, then student name, that's the name of my variable, and I'm setting it equal to an initial value of Ricardo. And by doing that, I do equal, then I put the value that I want, and then semicolon. And that's the end of the statement. So here, the reason why I put Ricardo in quotations is because Ricardo is a type string variable. Meaning there are different types of variables that you can have in JavaScript. You can have strings, numbers, booleans, and objects.
Dad works at J&B's junkyard. He's the manager of that junkyard.
All right. So let's say we wanted a variable that was of type number. Then we would set that equal to a number. Booleans, like for example, like 5, 10, 20, whatever. Booleans is true or false. So it can only hold two values for a Boolean variable, either true or false. And objects. Objects is something that you'll discuss later on, so don't worry about them now. We're just going over the basics. So right here we have a declaration of a variable. Any questions on this structure and how we write it? Good? Okay, silence means that everyone's cool, so we'll go ahead and move on to if statements. So if statements are kind of decision makers. If something, do something. So essentially, let's say you want to buy the latest pair of Jordans or something, and they're $200. if you have $200, then you can buy the Jordans. Else, don't buy them because you don't have enough money. So that's a decision, right? We made a decision, okay, I can buy the shoes because I met a condition. That condition being I have the money. So the way that we write that in code is with if, and then in parentheses is going to be a conditional expression. That's where you say, like let's say for the example, I say wallet equals $200. And then inside of the curly brackets, it's the code you want to happen. So if we translate what I just said into code, let me zoom in on here so you can see it clearly. So I'm going to have a variable wallet. Okay. Now I'm going to set it equal to 400. And that to me means my wallet contains $400. If wallet is equal, and two equal signs means that you're comparing. One equal signs means you're changing the value. So if wallet equal 200, then I can buy Jordans. And let's pretend that buy Jordans is a function that allows you to purchase the Jordans, right? And then we can update our wallet to subtract the $200, right? So we could do wallet equals wallet minus 200. Why are we minusing 200? Because we bought the Jordans, they cost $200. So now we need to update our wallet. So if we run this command again, wallet is $200. Is wallet equivalent to $200? Yes. Then we're going to subtract another $200. Now we're left with $0 because we bought two pairs of Jordans. So if wallet equal to 200, no, it's not, because now it's equal to 0, so we can't buy it. So what happens if this condition is not met is going to jump to the next line of code. So whatever this code is, I'm just going to write code, it's going to execute this line of code because this wasn't met. Therefore, everything in here was skipped. This code is only executed if this expression equals true. So you can write an else statement as well. So if else, so if the wallet you have $200, you can go ahead and do this. Otherwise, don't buy. I'm going to say there's another function that will perform that it means don't buy the shoes. So that's an if-else statement. Now you can do if-else if you have multiple conditions you want to check. So if-else if wallet is, let's say, greater than 1,000, or actually let's do less than 100, then you can do something else, right? So if the wallet is equal to $200, we'll do this. Let's say it's not. Then we're going to say if it's less than 100, actually, I'm just realizing something. This isn't going to work because we're checking to see if wallet is equal to 200 and it's equal to 400. So we want it to be equal, greater than, or equal to 200. So that brings up a point. When you're writing your code, you want to verbally go through it to see if it makes sense. So as I was going through it, I noticed that that didn't make sense. So if wallet is greater than and equal to 200, then we can buy the Jordans, meaning we have $200 or more. If wallet is less than $100, then you could say like buy gum, right? Because you can afford that with less than $100. And something of that nature. There's also if, else, if, else statements. So that's essentially you have multiple conditions that you need to check. And then if all of them fail, then you have else. Do something. right? So this isn't valid code. So by no means don't try to think that this is like a combination of real code with pseudocode. But essentially what we're doing here is we're checking to see if one condition is met. If that's true, cool, we'll go ahead and do this. Now, if that's done, it's going to go down to this next line of code, else if. And then it's going to check that and perform that. Otherwise, it'll go to the else. So that's if you have multiple conditions you're checking. Like, for example, if you have like a grading system, right? If grade is between 100 and 90, then it's an A. Else if grade is between 90 and 80, then it's a B. Else if, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, else, fail. Does that make sense? Any questions on if and else if statements? Everyone feels 100% with if statements? No questions? All right, this is very important. You're going to be using if statements, so it's absolutely imperative that you understand if statements. All right, we'll keep going then. Next, we'll go ahead and discuss arrays. An array is a data structure that we use to store values. You can think of them as a collection of values, and you can use an array to store multiple values. You can also think of arrays as lists. So let's look at a grocery list, for example. If we had a grocery list, let's say you need to buy rice, beans, apples, whatever you need to do, then you can put that in a list, and that entire list can be wrapped in an array. So if we look at this example, we're declaring a variable right here. We have the var fruit array, and now we have a value of type array. So how we indicate arrays is with the square brackets, and each element is separated by a comma. So here we have an array of strings. So we have apples, oranges, peaches, bananas, grapes. So each of these is an element inside of the array. So how many elements do we have in our fruit array? Anybody?
So as long as you're kind of keeping us in the link, like I had one gentleman who said he still would have 5. I don't expect
5, exactly. We have 5 elements in our fruit array. Now, in order to see which elements where, we have something called an index. An index is kind of like a pointer. It's pointing to a particular item in the array, a particular element. Indexes, and in all coding, we start off with 0, right? So normally you want to think like, okay, this is the first one, second one, third, fourth, fifth, right? So naturally we want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But indexes work differently. They start at 0. So fruit array at index 0 is equal to the first element. So that's going to be apples. So you can think of it as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So how many indexes are there, or indices, I don't know how to say that in plural, are there in fruit array?
4?
Yes, the last one is 4, exactly. So that brings me on to the next topic. Array length, we decided that there were 5 elements, but the last index is index 4. So when you're trying to figure out the length of an array, or you're trying to figure out the last index of an array, you would figure out the array length first, and then subtract 1 to get the last index. So for example, we are looking at var fruit array. I'm going to make this shorter for the example. We have apples, oranges, pineapples. Then length is going to equal fruit array dot length. So what is dot length? Dot length is a method that exists for strings and arrays that's going to return the length of the fruit array. So here, forgot my semicolons. So length is now equal to 3, because we have 3 elements. Fruit array dot length, we count 1, 2, 3. There are 3 elements. That's the total length. If we want the last index, that's going to equal our total length minus 1, right? Because we started at 0. So 0, 1, 2. The length is 3. 3 minus 1 is 2. That's how we get our last index. Or you could have just written this all in one pretty line and done so we know that the last index is going to be the length of the array minus 1. So and this is going to be helpful, especially once you get to your final project where you have to loop through a string of characters and count the total number of words and spaces and things of that nature. So here, where you would have to figure out the length of something. So let's say we don't know, we didn't have this information, right? Let's say fruit array was just given to us. We can still figure out the last index without knowing what's inside of that fruit array. Just by doing fruit array dot length, we know the total length, and then we can minus 1 to get the last index. So you don't have to know what's inside of the array in order to get the length or to figure out what the last index is. Any questions on this? Everyone's good? No questions? Everyone feels super awesome about arrays? All right. So we'll go ahead and discuss different methods that exist for arrays. So we just went over dot length. Let's go over dot push and dot pop. Before we begin, does anyone know what these are already? Okay, I'm going to assume no because there's silence. So if we go back to what we had here, we know dot length is going to return the length. Now, let's say I wanted to add something else to my list. So let's pretend this is a list of fruit that I need to buy at the grocery store. I remember, oh, I need grapefruit. So we're going to push grapefruit onto our array. So here I'm pushing grapefruits onto my fruit array. So it is doing what you think it's doing. It's pushing this onto the end of the list. So now if we were to return the value of fruit array would now equal apples, oranges, pineapples, grapefruits. Right? So now we have added grapefruits to fruit array. Now the opposite of that is pop. And the cool thing about this Visual Studio Code, if you notice, it returns what it's doing. Like there's a little pop-up notification telling you what that method does in case you ever forget. But fruit.pop is going to remove the last element of the array. So now fruit array equals what it normally started off with, which is apples, oranges, pineapples, because it popped off the last element. And something that you really want to remember with push and pop is going to put everything at the end. So if you need to put something at the beginning, that's going to require different kind of code. But push and pop is always going to put it at the end. Any questions on these methods?
So you don't have to add the fruit array to dot pop when you're like removing something.
Yeah, that's supposed to say fruit array.
Okay.
Yeah, good catch. Anybody else have any questions? All right, we'll go ahead and keep moving. We'll go ahead and discuss the loops. Now, this is very important. Loops is something that you'll be using and reusing and using and reusing. Loops enable us to repeat a series of commands until a certain condition is met. So let's take, for example, the project that you're going to run into at the end. They're going to give you a sentence, and you're going to have to go through that sentence and count the total number of spaces, for example. So you have to loop through every single character in that sentence to check a condition. So instead of, manually writing, sentence at index 0, is this equal to this? Sentence at index 1, is this equal to this? So on and so forth. That's a lot of lines of code. Instead of doing that manually, you can just create a loop that will do it for everything that you set the loop for. So there are different kinds of loops that exist. There's while loops, until loops, for in, for of. But what I'm going to be discussing primarily is a for loop. I think for loops are kind of like the fundamentals of all loops. So if you can understand a for loop, you can translate that into other loops. So the construction of a for loop is you have the word for, and then in parentheses, there's 3 segments. So the first segment, we're going back to declaring a variable. We're declaring a variable I, and we're having a starting point, and that starting point is 0. So as I mentioned before, indexes start at 0, so most commonly you're going to start at 0. And I is chosen because I index, but you can put anything for I. It doesn't have to equal I. You can change the name of this, and this doesn't have to be 0. If you know that you want your loop to start on the 5th index, you can just do var I equals 5 or var index equals 5. This is just a starting point. The next segment, followed by a semicolon, is your stopping point. So as we're going through the loop, we're constantly updating this variable I, or whatever you decided to call it. Once I does not meet the condition that you set in the middle, then we're going to exit the loop. So for this, let's pretend our stopping point is the number 10. So as long as I is less than 10, it will still execute this code in between these curly brackets. But once I is equal to 10 or 11, right, because 10 is not less than 10, then it's going to exit the for loop and go to this next line of code. That's whatever you wrote here. The last part of the parentheses is I++, and that means you're just incrementing the variable I by 1 after every iteration. So essentially one way you can think of it is we start at 0, right? Oops, we start at 0, we do some stuff, cool. Now we add 1 to I. I is now equal to 1. Is I less than 10? Yep, it is. Cool, we'll do this. Add 1 to I. Now it's 2. Do the stuff. Keep going. Still less than 10. Now we get to 9, right? I is equal to 9. 9 is less than 10. Cool, we'll go ahead and execute this code. We add 1. Now I is equal to 10. Is 10 less than 10? No, it's not. So we're going to exit the loop and then go to our next line of code. So after the parentheses, you'll have your set of curly brackets. And anytime you hear the word code block, that means a set of curly brackets. So this is a code block. And in here, we'll write whatever we want to happen. So let's look at an example. So let's say I'm creating a for loop. I want to print out the numbers 1 through 10. So I'm going to write a for loop for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable, I, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. Then I'm going to say I less than 11 because I want it to print out the number 10. And if I is less than 10, once I is equal to 10, it's going to exit and that number 10 will never be printed. So I'm going to set it I less than 11. Then I'll do I++. And then here, I will console log I. So this will print out 0 through 10. Now, if you want to see that in action, one place you can go, let me actually open that up, is Google Chrome. So if we exit here, we go here, we can, if you open Google Chrome and right click it, you go to inspect, you can go to console, and then if we copy the code that I just wrote, you see it printed out 0 through 10. If I wanted to print out 1 through 10, I would just change my beginning value, right? Now it's printing 1 through 10, and so on and so forth. Let's say I wanted 5 through 10. We see 5 through 10. So this is a really awesome tool for JavaScript when you're trying to figure out what's going on or seeing if your variables are in fact doing what you want them to do, or I mean equal to what you want them to equal. You can go ahead and open up your console in Java and play with your JavaScript so you can see if it's valid or not. So this is a really great way to test your code. Any questions on for loops? Everyone feels really good about for loops? Something you'll be using a lot, so you want to make sure that you have a really good understanding of a for loop. Do not be afraid to ask me questions. All right, we'll keep going then. So that is our for loop. Next, we'll go ahead and discuss functions. Functions allow us to reuse a block of code without having to rewrite it multiple times. So let's say you wanted to add 2 numbers. Like every time a user inputted 2 numbers, you wanted those 2 numbers to be added and return the sum. So instead of having to manually write that out every single time a user inputs 2 numbers, you can create a function that gets called on when that happens. So the breakdown of a function works like this. So here we write function. This is similar to when we wrote var for declaring variables. So here we're declaring a function. Okay, so normally we had var, name of variable equals whatever. Here we're going to have function, then the name of the function. Then after the name of the function, you'll have parentheses. Inside of those parentheses are going to be your parameters. You can have 0 parameters, or you can have like a bunch of parameters. Depends on what your function needs. This is essentially information that's being passed on that you'll need in order to execute the code. If your function doesn't require any previous information, then you can leave whatever's inside of the parentheses empty. Then, followed by the parentheses, you'll have another code block where you execute your code. So if we look at, let's go to the console so you can see it here. Oh, I thought that would clear it. Okay, so let's say we have I'll write it out here first actually. So let's say we have a function that says hello, right? I'm going to call my function says hello. In there, I don't need any parameters. I don't need any information in order to perform this function. Then it followed by curly brackets. Then I can do like console.log hello. Oops.
Well, that's why you got to be careful about using the same pattern.
All right, so then anytime I call in this function says hello, it's going to console log hello. So the way that we call a function is by writing the function name along with its parameters. This doesn't require any parameters, but we still put the parentheses, and then after the parentheses, we write our semicolon. So now, when this line of code runs, the console is going to log hello. Now, if we have another function that does require parameters, let's say we have add numbers, we can have first number or second number, right? So then in here, I'm going to have a variable called sum, and I'm going to set it equal to first number plus second number. And I'm going to return the sum. Now you might be asking you, what does return mean? That means we are, whoever or whatever called this function, we're going to return that value, add numbers. So let's say that you had some code outside of here that you required a sum of two things, right? Like let's pretend it's a bank account and you're depositing money. And the first number is going to be equal to what you have originally, and the second number is going to be what you're adding. So you can have like a variable called total balance, and you can set that equal to the function. And I'm going to write my balance currently, and then I'm going to add a number to that, right? So now what's happening is we're declaring a variable total balance and we're setting it equal to a function. So when we do this, this is invoking the function add numbers. So we're going to, what the code does, what the computer does, it says, okay, for our total balance, add numbers. Okay, that's a function. I'm going to go ahead and jump to this function. What's the first number? 2000. Okay, cool. What's the second number? 500. Okay, cool. So sum is now equal to 2000 plus 500. So now I'm going to return sum, which is equal to 2500. And now total balance equals 2500. Any questions on this right here? Everyone feels really good about this? You have no questions?
So you can have more than just two parameters in there, right? You could add
yeah,
numbers.
Right. You can put as many parameters as you need. Like that list can go on for as long as you need it to do, depending on what your function is doing.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any other questions? All right, cool. We'll keep going then. Oh, and just a touch on functions. You can have like functions within functions, like function inception. And you might see that when you're like looking up code and things of that nature. Just a touch on that. Next thing I want to go ahead and discuss is scope. So scope is the area in which your variables and functions can be accessed. There's three kinds. We have global, function, and block. Global means it's declared outside of a block or function and it can be accessed from anywhere. So that's why it's called global, right? Like it's all over worldwide. So you can access, like let's say I had some variables here. Right? So this something variable can be accessed anywhere in this code. It's considered global. Now, you technically don't want to use global functions as much because that can lead to a lot of errors in the end, but it is an option for you. If you need something available for absolutely everything, you can go ahead and do that. Another scope is the function scope. So that goes back to here, var sum. So sum is only available inside of this function. If I console log sum out here, outside of my function, we're going to get an error. It's going to say sum undefined because sum is not global, right? It's only in the scope of the function. So that's function scope. The last scope we have is block. So let's say we had an if statement, right? If something is greater than 10, I'm going to write a little bit of pseudocode. Do something, we'll do like total equals something plus 90, right? So total, we haven't declared this, so it's going to freak out. They're like, what is total? But we can let total equal something, right? And we're just letting it equal that temporarily inside of this code block, right? Because we just need it for here inside of this if statement. And then once we exit these curly brackets, total is no longer available to us. So that's a block scope. So this is a code block, and that is a block scope. So it kind of works like function scope, right? Because sum is inside of a function block, so it's function scope. But let's say this wasn't inside of a function, it was like outside, and you just need it for this section of your code, then you would use let, and that would be block scope. Now, this is something that you'll get used to and work with and see where these errors and how this all works once you start working on your code, because there will be times where you're writing a function or you're writing some code and you want to access a variable, but the scope doesn't match. So it's not working as you think it would be working. You're like, man, why isn't it returning the sum? Oh, that's because sum is not in this scope. So it's very important, especially for debugging when you don't know what's going on. Any questions on scope so far? No questions? I don't believe y'all. Someone has a question. All right, we'll keep going then. Next, we'll go ahead and discuss DOM, Document Object Model. It is a programming interface for HTML documents. It essentially provides a visual representation of the HTML elements you placed in your document. So when we write, let me go to the code. When we write HTML, right, and I say each one, this is something, right, and I save that, I save this, and I open my project app. We see this. This is the DOM. This is the visual representation of our HTML code.
I just sent you how to do it. Oh,
So now in the DOM, you can grab elements by different things. We're going to focus on by ID, but there's by tag name, by class, by all sorts of things. So here for get element by ID, how this works is we're going document. So we're looking at the document. That's our HTML document. Then we're getting an element by ID. What's an element? We look here. This is an element. This is an element. Those are the things in our tags, right? Those are the things that we targeted in our CSS. So we're grabbing an element by its ID. In order to grab an element by its ID, it needs to have an ID. So here in your opening tag, just like you do in CSS, you write your ID and you set it equal to something. So I'm going to set this ID name to heading, right? So then in my JavaScript, if I do document.getElementById and I do heading, that's going to grab this entire element, right? If I want whatever in between these tags, so let's say you grab this whole element and you're like, okay, I don't want the entire thing. I just want what's inside of there. That's when you're going to use .inner HTML, right? That's the code that you write in between your tags. Inner HTML, inside of the HTML tags. Now you'll also see something like .value. This is something like, let's pretend you have like an input or a text area. Right? I have a text area, and I have an ID, and I set it equal to text, and then close my text area. So if we look at that, here we have this little text box, right? And let's say I write some stuff in there, right? If I do get element by ID, what did I call my ID? I called it text. I'm going to write text here, and I do dot value. This is going to return whatever is inside of the text area. Okay, so if I put hello world, then let's pretend I wrap this all and I want this equal to a variable. And I call it user input or something. So now user input would equal hello world. So it would grab the whole thing inside of there. So it had a period, so it would return a string, hello world. So now user input equals hello world. Any questions on this so far? You will be using a lot of this. All right.
Well, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
What would you use the first example for? I understand getting the middle section and a value, but why would you use the first example?
Inner HTML?
No, the one before that.
Oh, to grab the entire element?
Yeah, why would you, what would be the significance of doing that? What would be an example?
An example of that is, let's say you have a button and you wanted to add an event listener to your button. So in order to do that, you need to grab the entire element of the button in order to add an event listener. An event listener, like a click, like as soon as you click that button, you want something to happen. So first we need to grab the element of the button, and we'll do that by doing this. And let's pretend we had like a button here. My ID was button. And I say submit, blah, blah, blah. Right? So here, if I wanted to add an event listener, I can create a variable called button, or you can call it whatever you want. I'll get my element. So now, oops. So now button is equal to this entire element. It's equal to the whole HTML. So I can add an event listener to this variable button. And then I can do like listen for a click. And when that happens, I want a function to be performed, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense for the button. Yep.
Yeah. So that's like when you're adding event listeners and things of that nature, then you'll want to grab the whole element. All right. Any other questions? All right. Which brought me to my next point, add event listener. So as we were discussing, you can add an event listener, and you would do that for something like a button. And then there's different events that you can listen for. Well, most common one is click. And once that is clicked, then you'll perform a function. So either you can put like a function name, like let's say you had a function declared here, and called it bananas, and it did something, right? So if my event listener, once that click happens, I want bananas to be performed, right? So every time this click is made on this button, we're going to perform this function. Or what you can do is you can write the function in the code all in one, right? And then I can do the do something here. So you can do it one of two ways. Any questions on event listener? All right, go ahead and keep going. So the next thing is the Chrome inspector. I showed you this earlier. But essentially, when you are working on your code and it's not doing what you want it to do, you can go ahead, do the whole inspect, and then go to the console. And if there is an error in a big red box, it will appear here with the error message. This is very important when you're debugging. So if it says like undefined method or undefined variable, you know that you didn't define a variable or a function. So it gives you a clue of what went wrong, so you can go back to your code and fix that. So it's very important. I like error messages. People get scared when they get an error message, but that's how you learn, is through the errors. And especially knowing how to read errors is a very important thing. So if it's undefined something, you know you forgot to declare it somewhere. So don't be afraid of the big red boxes. That's a way for you to learn of what's going on and how you can read your code and interpret it. And it'll give you a better understanding of how your code is working. So very important tool. If you don't have Google Chrome, I highly recommend in downloading it so you can use those tools. Also, Google Chrome has all these really cool plugins to help you as well. As you move along, you can utilize those tools for your advantage. Like one thing I really like is this little box with the arrow here. You click on that and you can grab an entire element that you want to be looking at. So let's say I wanted to play with this, right? And this was in my CSS, this was all aligned all crazy and I wanted it to be in the middle. When I have it highlighted, it pops up all the styles that are attached to that. And then here, I can just play with those, right? I can move my padding, or I can put it there and then I want to like change the value. I just want to test it out. So this is like, if you want to play around with your code, instead of having to write it in your code, save it, reload, and oh, that didn't work, write it, save it, reload, you can just play directly inside of your console and see how it's affecting it. And then if it turns out to be something that you like, then you can go ahead to your code and change this. The console is not going to change your code, but it'll allow you to debug it, right? So that is one really cool thing. And then last thing I'm going to be talking about is if you are in the project for your JavaScript, where you're counting spaces or you have to write a grade system, there are tutorials out available for you. If you go to the student resource page, repo.exeterlms, you can click on videos, then under tutorials/campus lectures, you can click on tutorial videos, and then the 7th video on the list is a walkthrough similar to CFS JavaScript project. So I'll go ahead and show you where you can find that. So go to the student repo, repo.exeterlms, go to videos, then under tutorials and campus lectures, tutorial videos, and 7th one, walkthrough similar to CFS JS project. Now, it's not the exact same project, of course, we wouldn't be giving you the answer, but it goes through looping through a text and counting the total number of vowels. So very similar. You're going to want to use the exact same concepts that this project is using, but tweak it, right, so that it works for your needs. There's also a bunch of other tutorials here in case, you need to go over for loops or things like that. And that concludes the lecture for today. Are there any questions? No? Everyone's good? All right. If you do happen to have questions, feel free to message me on Slack or hit up your mentor on Slack. And thank you for coming.